Welcome to Puente Lab, a podcast where we have conversations around mental health. I'm your host, Dr. Jonathan Martinez, professor in the Department of Psychology at California State University, Northridge. My Puente Research Lab focuses on addressing mental health disparities in care for underserved communities, particularly for Latino families. The goal of our podcast is to create a bridge between science and the community. Today's guest is Andres Reconco. Andres is a high school English teacher with over 19 years of experience working in Los Angeles Unified School District. Currently, he is an instructional coach that works closely with teachers to develop curriculum to ensure connections between academics and careers. Yeah, we're really happy to have you here with, someone that has such extensive experience working in schools and being a teacher for almost 20 years now. What was the inspiration or what led you to be a teacher?
So I didn't always want to be a teacher, right? I've been into computers for a long time. When I went to college, that's what I thought I was going to do. But then started taking the classes and realized that just wasn't what I wanted to study. It was boring. There was a lot of math. Right. And it just wasn't, and I didn't have enough guidance, I think, to know the possible path that I could take. And then I started working at a high school as a teacher's assistant. Mm-hmm. And started to work one-on-one with students, and then realized that I liked doing that type of work. I was an English major at the time, and it just sort of it fit. It felt like the right path to take, and then that was my journey into the classroom.
So being within L.A.U.S.D for past 20 years, and our podcast, we think about mental health and also maybe how things have changed over time. What have you kind of observed in students in terms of like conversations around mental health, compared to like early 2000s up until now?
I get the sense that over the past, 5 to 10 years, maybe, I felt like there were a lot more students in my classes who were more open about their mental health problems, right? The things that they were struggling with at home, the things that they were struggling with at school. So the conversations became more out in the open, right? I feel like at the beginning of my career as a teacher, those conversations just weren't taking place. Like students weren't necessarily talking about the struggles that they were having. I mean, they came out obviously, right? Like they were there. Just because they didn't have the language for them doesn't mean that those things didn't exist. Yeah. But and so maybe that's another thing too, right? They didn't have the language to talk about what was happening inside of their heads. Right. And then for some reason, and I don't know exactly why, right, over the past 5 to 10 years, that language started to come out more. Right? There was a lot more talk about anxiety, and there was a lot more talk about depression, and there was a lot more talk about, like the specific ways in which anxiety or depression was coming out, right, was manifesting itself. And then also obviously through the structures in the district as well, I feel like there's been a lot more emphasis on social and emotional learning as a tool that is required inside of the classrooms to create a more welcoming, safe, equitable environment for students. So there's a lot of different forces that sort of started coming out in the past, at least my experience, right, in the past 5 to 10 years, that perhaps created the right space for students to communicate about, their mental health journeys.
Yeah. So like, while I do see that the generationally, like students have changed in terms of their comfort level and maybe the language, also maybe schools are seeing like there are needs that need to be addressed. But I don't know, you've been the expert within the schools of like their level of integration of mental health within the school district.
So a couple of things, right? The first one was the whole generational thing, right? Like for me, for example, when I was in high school and I had my own sort of, problems, right? Things that I couldn't discuss at home. There wasn't a system in place at school that made it feel like it was okay to feel that way, right? That I wasn't living in some sort of bubble, right? That this experience only belonged to me. And part of that, right? Part of that absence of that came, I think, from the fact that wasn't something that we discussed at home. Like that's not, like my mom and I never had conversations about how I was feeling, like what could she do to alleviate whatever pressures I was feeling at home and at school. Like that couldn't happen. You know, there's like a very clear, you need to like work, you need to go to school, you need to learn. And if you feel sad, if you feel angry, that's just how things are. That's just life, right? And there are no tools to address that. And I feel like now what's happened is that the space has been created for these things, right, to be demystified, right? That mental health is no longer a thing that you keep quiet about. That issues with mental health require help, and that there are so many people around you who are going through the same thing, right? Who have similar anxieties, similar whatever pain, trauma that they're carrying around, and talking about it is not as shameful. I mean, it still is, I think, because a lot of our parents still communicate some of that idea that it's pointless, right? If you don't know yourself, if you don't know how to fix yourself, then something's wrong with you if you can't do that on your own.
Right.
But I feel like some students are already trying to break through those generational barriers, right? And so I feel like those structures are creating what's that cliche? Like they're lifting the curtain, right? On mental health and the services that are available and the things that you can do to help yourself with that. So,
you were kind of describing like, your upbringing a bit, which is very similar to my background of like, our parents didn't really talk about mental health. Of course they cared about us, but it was also very circumscribed around like, are you doing well in school? Right. So at least for me, it was like, as long as you're getting good grades, you're fine. Like there's nothing else to check in about. Whereas, if you're a student maybe that's like, missing classes or getting in trouble, that's when you get on the radar. Like even if maybe at home, maybe the conversations aren't there, are you seeing it in like the school itself? You said like the past 10 years, you're seeing like kind of more of a push. How are you seeing more of a push about mental health?
Talking about my school district, like there's a unit that's dedicated for social and emotional learning, right? That's what it's called. It's called the Social Emotional Learning Unit within the district. And that unit's sole responsibility is to ensure that there are resources at the school, right, available to teachers, available to maybe even the PSWs. I'm not entirely sure all of the pieces and how it works, but
PSW is like a psychiatric social worker.
Yes, right. That's So this unit, I think they provide like the digital tools or access to digital tools so that students and teachers can learn about what social and emotional learning is, right? Like what are some of the strategies that teachers can use in their classrooms?
Right.
Yeah.
Does that put maybe some unfair pressure on teachers? It's like teachers are overburdened in so many ways, right? And you kind of hear like teachers are expected to be babysitters and parents. And of course, like their training is on teaching curriculum, but they're also expected to, be supportive and empathic and check in with their students. And also like, there's this push on like, mental health. And there is a camp that maybe feels like, well, what is the role of schools in mental health? Like, is it really the responsibility of teachers to also have to bear the burden of making sure that their mental health needs of their students are addressed? Like, where do you see that? And how might that also create like unfair burden for teachers too?
Yeah, that's a tough one. Is it a burden on teachers? I feel like it is an added responsibility, right? That is put on us to be very mindful of our students' behaviors, to not only teach our curriculum, but also pay attention to the humans on our desks, right? Like in front of us, in a way that is, I don't know, that is very like focused, in a way that is sort of exhausting, to be able to not only teach my curriculum, deal with classroom management issues that arise, right? Be a mentor and a coach to the student as they are progressing through the lesson, through the curriculum that I've outlined for them, right? And then on top of that, to be very mindful of behavior changes, right? To be very mindful of things that they write about And then on top of that, to then know how to navigate that in a way that is helpful for the student,
Right.
in a way that encourages the student to seek help, right? In a way that doesn't diminish that student's feelings, right? Like maybe our parents did, right? So does it put an undue burden on the teacher? I think it puts an extra responsibility that some teachers are just not necessarily willing to take on, for whatever reason. I don't know, right? Like I can only speak from my experience in my classroom with my students. It was a challenge sometimes to be present for them, and also allow myself space to be mentally ready to tackle the next class that's coming in.
Right.
You know what I mean? So
Yeah.
like just doing my job, doing it well, having the energy to do it well, like all of that, there's a lot of forces fighting for that.
Right. Which is why,
Yeah.
Teacher burnout is a real thing. And, sometimes there's a knock on teachers maybe being disengaged or not caring. And you also have to think of how they might have been in a position for so long, and having to deal sometimes with classroom management, where it's like, I didn't sign up for this. Like I wanted to be an English teacher and, teach this particular type of curriculum. How might students get on the radar of a teacher when it comes to maybe having a mental health issue? Is it them coming to you? Is it more things you observe?
Sometimes it comes through as behavior changes, right? Maybe one day the student is really engaged. They are participating in activities. Their grades are holding steady at a whatever grade they're holding steady at. And then one day that changes, and it's not like a subtle change, it's like a drastic change. They're disengaged, they look tired, you can tell that they're distracted in class. You can tell that there's something in their mind, right? So that's a moment where I, as a teacher, would then approach that student and have a conversation and figure out what's happening, right? Other times it comes through their writing, right? Sometimes they'll write things that that set off alarm bells, right? And then we have to have really difficult conversations. I as an employee for the district, I am a mandated reporter, right? Which means that there are some things that if students write them, I have to report them,
Right?
And part of my responsibility as an English teacher was making sure that students understood that. And sometimes students would come and say, hey, can we have a conversation? Can I talk to you about something that's happening? And then other times it was very clear that there was something wrong with the student. There would be panic attacks, right? Anxiety attacks in the classroom.
Right.
Sometimes, I would have students who would be drunk,
Yeah.
In the classroom, and just things that start a conversation. Some of those conversations lead to finding out that there are some serious things happening, maybe at home, or maybe, a student is struggling with some social thing at school that is causing a lot of stress and anxiety.
What happens at that point? Is there a referral system set up? Is it more of talking to the kids? Are parents looped into what's going on?
Right. The first step was always talking to the student, right? And figuring out what is happening. Sometimes, like any of us, they just need somebody that they can talk to, right? And that helps, right? A lot of them just being able to have somebody to trust with something that is happening to them. It's not serious enough that it requires the next step. But if it is something serious that I, as a teacher, can't support, can't address, or it would be irresponsible for me to even try, then it would be a conversation with the student about whether or not I can refer them to the PSW. Right. If the student says, I would like to talk to a professional, then there's a referral system that I would fill out. The PSW then contacts the student, gets pulled out of class, and that conversation starts, right? And then it's the PSW to figure out what is the intervention plan, what is it that needs to happen. And obviously they do that with their own, professional training, right? Parents get involved at some point in the process. I've had situations where services are required outside of what the school can provide, you know, and the PSW then refers the parent, right, to this other agency, to this other support system that exists. So parents do get pulled in.
In your experience at L.A.U.S.D, like, would you notice that parents would kind of initiate and kind of try to connect with you as a teacher? Or was it maybe you trying to reach out to parents more?
That obviously varies from school to school, right? At our school, it was a challenge to get parents to come to things, right? Like, you know, for parent conferences, for example, you know, out of like my 120 students that I had, maybe I would see 20 parents if I was lucky, right? That's obviously for many different reasons, right? My mom was one of those parents who never went to parent conferences. She worked the whole day, you know, and then she would come home and then have to deal with whatever it meant to come home and, you know, do things for the house, cook, clean, whatever it is that she had to do. And I think that's true of a lot of our parents. A lot of our parents work a lot. They work really late. They might not have the language, right, necessary to communicate with people at the schools who don't speak their language, right? I knew that was the case. You know, I speak Spanish, so like I could communicate really well with the parents of my students who spoke Spanish.
Right.
But I also had like Korean parents who I would call, and then the child had to translate for me.
Right.
And like, how do I know that they're communicating what I'm saying?
You know like what I mean? Saying I'm doing well in school.
Yeah, exactly.
Everything's going fine.
Right. That, but also, you know, the complexity of the situation cannot be communicated.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Everything gets, if the language isn't there, everything gets treated very simplistically, very superficially, and it's very hard to get to the core of things that are happening if you don't have the language, right, to communicate.
Right.
You know, our parents are immigrant parents, like my parents are immigrants, right? And this sense of always feeling like an other, right, in this country, that feeling gets in the way of wanting to talk to people at the schools, because they always feel like an other. They don't feel part of the community of the school.
Right.
And even having your own kid then talk about personal things to a teacher, you know, like revealing things that belong in the house, you know, in the home. Like, people are very protective of what is happening in the home, right? And if you feel like you are not part of this community at the school, if you feel like an other in this country, you're going to try to dissuade your child from engaging in these systems that are there to help them.
What are some other obstacles that you find that might make it hard for parents to then get connected? We were talking about language as being an obstacle.
I feel like there's a lot of feeling inadequate, and as parents, we don't like feeling inadequate, right? About things relating to our kids, that we want to be in control of everything. But I know my mom always felt inadequate, right? She didn't know what classes she didn't know how to help me with homework, right? She didn't know the way that the classes work. Like, she was always confused that I had 6 classes, you know, every day. Like, wow, like, you know,
that
like,
doesn't make sense.
Yeah, she didn't. And you know, and she also didn't. She dropped out of school in the 4th grade, you know. So just a disconnect that made her feel like she couldn't be an asset to me.
Right.
So I wonder how true that is for other parents, you know, and how that keeps them from engaging in the school community.
Yeah, like sometimes maybe a disconnect between their own experiences or, you know, not knowing how to navigate a system, because schooling is a system, right?
And there are structures in the schools that encourage parents to come, right? Like, you know, at our school we still have a governing board, right? And it's a system that's there to create budget choices in the school, like where does money go, and parents are part of that group, and students are part of the group, administration, teachers are part of that group. There are this thing called breakfast with the principal, coffee with the principal, right? Where parents are encouraged to come and like just meet with the principal and ask questions and have conversations. But at our school, it was always a very small group of parents who were involved.
Well, like you said, it sometimes just comes down to like these logistical barriers of like, well, when are these things being offered? Oh, well, during the school day, 8 to 3. Oh, well, I work, or I can come, but now what about childcare or like transportation or, a lot of these logistical issues. We could talk about all these resources and other things, and sometimes it just comes down to that. Like, are there other times where there's availability, like in the evening or maybe early morning? But even that then kind of puts pressure on, well, now teachers need to come in earlier or stay later because they're already stretched for resources. And, is it the responsibility of the school to ensure that childcare and transportation is being provided? But we know the bottom line, sometimes that's what just prevents parents from coming or being involved.
Yeah. If you have small children, if you are a single parent, right? Like, and you have to come home and prepare whatever needs to be prepared. Like, I feel like sometimes school and your child's progress in school and whatever is happening at school gets sort of pushed to the side, and this institution is trusted as, well, you're probably doing what you need to do to keep my child healthy and alive, right? And educated.
Have you ever been involved in some of those budgetary decisions, or how does budget even get discussed at schools with like how much we're going to allocate towards mental health? Or you were talking about like PSWs, like a psychiatric social worker. Is that the responsibility of like the school itself to say like, we want our operating budget to include, someone that's specialized in mental health?
I have friends who are in administration, and like they talk about those systems as being very complex and very complicated, So yeah, I mean, in my experience, it does seem to be a funding thing, and it is a choice that is left up to the school.
Right.
But I don't know exactly how it works.
Yeah, because that's where there's this, on the one hand, like I see this tension within schools of like there's this push towards emotional wellness and making sure like students' mental health needs are being addressed. And it's like, well, if you're improving their mental health, that's going to reflect in terms of their academics and their ability to perform well in school and standardized testing and other things. But sometimes, with limited resources, schools can't do that. And sometimes schools, there might be a mentality of like, we're not in the business of being clinicians. We're in the business of being educators.
Right.
And sometimes the bottom line comes down to, are students attending? Are they coming? And are they performing well on different, standardized tests?
What's happening is that different instructional practices are coming through that have social emotional learning embedded into them.
Okay.
So, for example, last year I was part of the Equitable grading and instructional or instruction team, right. And there was a lot of conversations around like, how does equitable grading help a student feel ownership over their learning? If I have a student who's coming in, and I don't know if this happened to you when you were in high school, but like being deducted, points being deducted from assignments because they were turned in late.
Yeah.
Or points being deducted from your overall grade in the class for you coming in late to class.
That was standard.
Right.
Yeah.
So eventually we realized that those systems are inequitable because we don't know why that student is coming late to class.
Right. It's
like,
not their
really,
fault
like,
at times.
Do all of them
Most
try?
of
Like how many of us were under the control of our parents' ability to arrive to things on time.
Right.
And now as a teacher, I'm lowering your score, not because of something academic that you have done, not because of a demonstration of skills, but rather because of behavior. And that contributed negatively to how students saw themselves in the classroom. So that now there's this understanding, let's get rid of that, right? Let's not include behavior in the general grade and the overall grade of the student. Instead, let's use the behavior categories in the grades. How I don't know how it was with your grade, but with your grades, but it was like BEE, right? And you have those two letters. One was cooperation and work habits.
Okay.
Use those to communicate behavior to the class. Leave that academic grade specifically for what can this student do academically, right? Based on the standards that the state has put out, how are they demonstrating to you that they know that? And once you do that, then now the student feels more in control of their academic grade.
I just remember that system of like how behavior impacted grades. You know, a lot of times kids and especially Latino families, like they're doing the best they can and they might be struggling in a certain area. And it's like, well, if they're now maybe showing or demonstrating their knowledge and they should have, you know, been doing well, but they came late or they turned in something,
right?
And
Or
it's punitive based,
right, or even something as simple as homework.
Yeah,
you know,
right.
like not all parents, not all families have a system set up where students have a space
to do
do homework.
Right.
You know, like a lot of my students went home and babysat.
Mm-hmm.
Because their parents were working. Like during Zoom classes, it was very obvious why some students weren't turning on their cameras, because when they would turn them on, you could see that they lived in a single apartment, right? That everybody was in the same space.
Yeah.
That the TV was always on in the background.
Multiple
that there was
families
some
there
child
sometimes.
screaming, and you know what I mean. And now I'm saying you have this homework assignment, and if you don't complete it tonight, your grade's gonna drop in my class.
Right.
And that might work for the student who has their own bedroom, who has a structure set up, who has parents who remove cell phones when they come home. There's some sort of discipline happening. But for the student who comes home to then babysit their 4-year-old brother and sister, how is that equitable?
Right.
Right. And then
there's an expectation that students are going to be able to do homework when we know that, you know, the resources and availability of being able to concentrate and be at home and have a space to do that is just going to vary.
Right, exactly. Right.
And why hold it against that student?
Right. So then what is the shift, right? What is the district doing? What the district doing is saying you can still give homework, right? It could still be a tool for practicing. It's not a bad thing to have a student say, hey, like, I feel like you could use this enrichment activity. See if you can do it tonight. Or, hey, like, I feel like you really need to practice this thing because, this is sort of like an area of growth for you. Practice it, right?
Right.
But then the next day, if they haven't, or if they have, it's not a thing that impacts the overall grade. It might go into the grade book.
Yeah.
It might be there as evidence that, this student has been given opportunities and they're not taking advantage of it for whatever reason, but it's not impacting their overall grade in my class. And that, I feel it gives the student a little bit of more room to breathe.
Right.
And I feel like that contributes to a student's sense of like belonging in a community and feeling less anxious about performing, or like about grades in school.
What about the kids with, anxiety or depression? Maybe they're just skating by. Maybe they're not failing, but they're passing, but they're definitely not performing to their potential. And they're also not disrupting, their fellow peers or other things. How do those kids get on the radar or unless, I guess I would imagine, unless they're seeking out help themselves. But like you as a teacher, like for those kids that are like, passing, so grades aren't an issue necessarily, classroom management is an issue, but it's kind of clear to you that maybe they're having some anxiety or depressive issues. How might they end up getting help?
I feel like those are the kids that get ignored
a
lot because they're not, like you said, they're not disrupting. They're a C. It's a C.
Yeah. They're passing.
You know what I mean? Like they're not gonna fail your class. They're still gonna move on to whatever the next level class is. So it is challenging, and I feel like it comes back to our role as a teacher to be hyper vigilant for those things.
It's impossible to be able to address every student's mental health issue. Like that's not, or just academic issue. You have a class of 30 students. Yeah, there might be a couple students that are misbehaving. Okay, that gets on, the radar of the teachers. And, if students are performing well, great, they're capturing the material. And then sometimes there's some students in the middle where you're like, they're maybe a bit lost, but they're doing it enough. And what do we do for them? And kids are very resilient many times and can figure stuff out on their own. And it makes me think too of like the Latino community. A lot of times in the work we do, there's this very like deficit based approach of like thinking of like what communities are lacking or like, they don't speak the language. They don't know, they have the knowledge around this area. What do you see as the strengths of, predominantly the students that you taught at L.A.U.S.D, were predominantly from Latino families.
Right.
Well,
Well,
what do you see as those strengths?
so I feel like the biggest strength is that parents care and that
Right.
parents want their students to succeed.
Yes.
You know, like the parents want to see their students achieve more than they did. Right? I mean,
Right.
that's big. The
That's
drive
huge.
is there. The desire is there. You know, the frustrations that those things might not be happening are there, right? And I feel like that's big. And obviously the students, I feel like there's this mentality that teenagers don't care and like, so aloof about everything. But kids care. Kids
Right.
want to do well. Like no kid in my classroom wanted to be left behind,
Right.
wanted to not to be underperforming. Nobody wanted that. That wasn't a reality for any of my students. They were just sort of the ones who were struggling and who would communicate that with like their body language or even the things that they said. And that was just the narrative that they had adopted for themselves, that they kept hearing over and over and over and over about who they were as learners.
Right.
And then at one point, like you just believe that, right? And you just like, you know what? It's easier to just let this adult believe that and leave me alone than to engage with difficulty, challenge, and possibly failure again.
Right.
Right. So, but a lot of the students want to succeed. So there's a lot of desire there to grow and to learn.
And like you mentioned, like this caring or like this assumption that, parents don't care or Latino parents don't want to be involved. That's one of the biggest misconceptions that, I hope that we can tackle, because you hear that all the time in the field of like mental health of like, oh, parents, they don't want to be involved. And Latino parents, they don't really, and it's like the message you're sending there is, I don't love my child.
Right.
Like even with schools, right? Like parents many times don't know they have the how they can be involved or how they can navigate, or maybe they're just doing enough, with like just meeting like basic survival and other things. And, if the message is that parents don't care, well, that's kind of a damaging message sometimes of like, there's almost this tendency to think of like, well, we don't need to do appropriate outreach or efforts to make sure that they're getting connected. What are other things that you think schools can do based off some of the things that we've been talking about to like address or ensure that like mental health needs of students are being met?
Perhaps resources around parenting classes, right? And that's also a sensitive subject for a lot of our Latino parents, right? To be told, hey, you need to go to a class to be a good parent.
Right.
But I feel like that's important, right? How do you navigate, especially if you're an immigrant parent, right? How do you navigate the school system here, right? What support systems can you already set in place with the younger kids, right? With your elementary school children, with your kindergarten, that will, increase the possibilities or the probability that they will do well in school, and then not stopping that. So like just a system of that structure throughout elementary, middle school, and high school. I feel like that's really important, and I see that happening already in some schools. There are already parenting classes. Like my school that I had, they teach a parenting class to students, to high school students, to the parents of the students, of the high school students,
Right.
about how to approach students, their kids, with empathy, right? How do you navigate the trauma that you carry as a parent, as well as perhaps the trauma that your child carries, right? So those conversations, they're already happening.
Yeah.
I just think there needs to be more of that. So then it comes back to like who's teaching those classes,
Yeah.
right?
Right.
Like, are you gonna have a teacher teach these classes?
Yeah.
Or are you going to have a professional, whatever organization that has the systems in place to teach these parenting classes?
Right.
How much does that cost?
Right.
Can the district afford that for all the schools?
Yeah.
So
Resources, like you said, budget.
how do you do this well?
Yeah.
So it doesn't just become a check mark, a box that you check.
We did it.
That says we did it.
Yeah.
But you're doing it poorly,
Right.
and now you've disengaged the whole new generation of parents
Mm-hmm.
who
Yeah.
are coming through your system because they realize that it doesn't work. It's pointless. It's not engaging. It's
Right.
boring.
Yeah.
Right?
And
So-
who are the people teaching it to, just in terms of like their own background and their identities, and something as simple as like, is it offered in Spanish? Do you have someone that looks like them, that knows some of the cultural values and beliefs and attitudes, that we're not trying to like place this, kind of like different type of, westernized parenting that might be different from one's own upbringing.
Yeah. How do you diversify that for the different neighborhoods? Mm-hmm. Right. L.A.U.S.D is huge.
Yeah.
Right. Like, how do you create? So all of that, it takes thought, it takes money, it takes, just knowledge of how these things, how the whole system operates.
Andres, thank you so much. Really enjoyed our conversation.
Yeah, thank
really
you for
enjoyed
having me.
you.
This was great.
Thank you for joining us today. To access more mental health content and resources, please go to puentelab.com. Until next time.